All right, and we're live.
Sweet.
Chat.
Excellent.
Hopefully, we have a good amount of people join today. We just actually started live streaming earlier this year, so it's been a lot of fun. But,
Mhm.
anyways, our guest today is a writer, public radio host, and creator of the Local Food Report, a weekly feature that has aired on the Cape and Island NPR station since 2008. She's deeply immersed in the local food culture. And now she wrote an awesome book called Feed Us with Trees, which I think is an incredible read. Very interesting from what I've read so far. And we're just super pumped to have her here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's Elspeth Hay.
Woo.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you here today. And I think it's honestly like perfect timing because we're kind of rolling into the fall months, and your book is about feeding people with wild trees or even, domesticated trees and whatnot. So, most of those trees are going to bear their fruit and their food later in the year. So I think it's perfect timing for this.
Mhm.
Glad we could make it happen now.
It's about to be prime harvest time, so it's exciting.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I figured let's just start with kind of the moment that kind of lit the fire, so to speak. Like what kind of happened when you first learned that these trees out there were edible? And I think it was acorns that really led you there, right?
Yes, definitely acorns. And it became a sort of literal fire later on, but it started out with a TEDx talk that a friend sent me by a woman named Marcy Mayer, who lives in Greece. And she said that acorns are edible and that they're actually a superfood and one of humanity's oldest foods. And I live in the middle of an oak forest. I had been interviewing people about food and farms for about 15 years at the time, and I had never once heard anyone say anything about eating an acorn. So I was pretty surprised to hear that news.
Yeah, I would say you're sitting inside of a whole food forest. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually went out to the driveway and like started picking up acorns and just looking at them like, wait, what? I thought this was squirrel food. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Right,
kind of like a crazy moment.
Had some
yeah.
rich squirrels.
Yes,
Did you try to munch on one right away, or would
I
you like? Did you
did,
know
and
enough? Oh, really?
she had said they were bitter before they're leached, so I expected it to be bitter, but still, it was quite bitter, and I immediately spit it out. Very similar to an experience I had in Italy once trying to eat an olive straight off the tree.
Mhm.
If you've ever tried that, not a
Yeah.
good plan.
No, it's a little not quite like what you get in the stores.
No, needs to be
Yeah.
processed.
Yeah, but your taste buds are a really good indicator. If things taste really off, maybe don't eat it raw and
Yeah.
try to figure out if it's not edible or if there's a certain way you got to process it, right? And that's kind of the case with acorns. You just got to process them correctly, and then you can render them edible, and they can be a great food source. And for me, always as a kid growing up, I grew up in Germany, and it was always the case that people said like, don't eat those, because I always wanted to eat the little acorns. They're poisonous. But yeah, it was later in life for me too that I found out that there's a lot of people eating these today, and people used to eat them for thousands of years.
Mhm.
That's really cool.
What was your food system worldview before you learned that you could eat acorns?
Pretty different.
Yeah.
I grew up inside of a myth that I like to call no farms, no food. So
Mm.
this idea that I grew up in a town in Maine with like a ton of farms, and my parents were bird watchers, and so they were always taking me and my sister on all these hikes to look at birds. We'd be going to like the mountains and the salt marsh and different ecosystems, and I always thought it was weird that like the birds were all perfectly adapted to all these different habitats, and every other species seemed to have a habitat, and then there was us, and apparently the natural world had nothing for us, and we just had to create farms. And I don't think I could have articulated it, but I definitely had the feeling as a kid of like, what is wrong with us? Like,
Mm.
why don't we make any sense like other animals? Um, and so I think in a variety of ways, I've kind of been trying to figure that out my whole life.
Yeah.
And the learning that we can eat acorns kind of cracked that story open for me.
Crack the
Um,
shell.
yeah, it was like, "Oh, wait," because I knew how important oaks are ecologically. Like, I had studied environmental science, and my mom actually, right around when I learned that we can eat acorns, my mom had gotten really into this entomologist named Doug Tallamy. So he was studying, like, the relationship between insects and different plants and had figured out that some plants are really heavy lifters in terms of supporting other life in their ecosystems and other plants not so much. And she had just sent me this thing on how oaks were the biggest life support plant in almost every place where they occur, just like this incredible resource for insects and other species. And so the fact that we could eat from those too, and that people had been eating acorns as a staple food, I was like, oh, wait, okay, maybe this story that I've learned is not true, and maybe there's a little bit to unpack here. And so that was
Mhm.
kind of when I fell down the tree nut rabbit hole, pretty
Mm.
deep down.
Yeah.
Oaks are such awesome trees. Like, I think people don't appreciate them enough. I know Lindy appreciates them because here in Montana, all we have is for deciduous trees is basically cottonwoods and aspen. So like when I
Yep.
take her to Wisconsin, she sees all these other awesome trees and the
And I'm like, "It's a
oaks with their
jungle."
yeah, with their gnarly branches and all that.
They're my
And yeah,
favorite.
from my understanding, I like from what I learned, I think they also require a good amount of fire traditionally to really like thrive. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if you know about this, but I'm pretty sure oaks are kind of like slowly dying out because of that.
Yeah, yeah. So that was another big surprise. So I was sort of started processing this whole idea that we can eat acorns, and I was trying to learn more about them. And one day was on, I don't know, online somewhere, just like searching the word acorn and books about acorns. And I found this book called Acorns and Salmon Feed Our People by a non-native sociologist named Kari Marie Norgard. And it was about the Karuk people of present day Northern California. And I reached out to her to learn more, and she introduced me to a cultural biologist and medicine man named Ron Reed. And it was like early COVID-19 pandemic, so we just spent a lot of time talking on Zoom, talking about acorns, and talking about traditional Karuk oak tending practices, because acorns have made up a huge part of their diet for thousands of years. And he started telling me that in order to take care of oak trees, you need fire. He kept saying, fire is medicine. You know, we light these sacred ceremonial fires at these world renewal ceremonies that we have, and those fires renew the landscape and they keep the earth in balance. And they're really important for oaks and a lot of other Kuruk cultural use species. And I kind of started to absorb that. I went out to the Klamath to see him and started seeing kind of firsthand what he was talking about. But it took me a while to realize that what he was talking about with fire in California actually also applied to a lot of other landscapes in North America.
Mhm.
So, oak trees are having trouble regenerating in a lot of areas, not just North America, but also in Europe, in Asia. And in all of those places, what's been happening is fire suppression. And
Mm.
oaks are kind of like this mid-successional species, right? So they actually don't like the closed canopy forest as a place to regenerate. They like some openings, they like a little bit of sunlight. And so human burning traditionally has helped them stay dominant on the landscape. And the more I started learning about this, the more intrigued I got, and ended up getting certified and prescribed fire. So now I've been
Mm.
going out on some burns, which has been so cool.
That's cool. I
Yeah,
gotta
it's
look into
really
that.
fun. It's really
Yep. Yeah.
fun.
Well, it kind of adds to this whole idea of wild tending that we talk a lot on the podcast. Like as foragers, we're always out there also trying to spread seeds and, you know, maybe in some places where there's too many invasives, try to kind of, influence that a little bit, but mostly just going out and like spreading your seeds and making sure your wild garden becomes more abundant. But adding like a fire skill to that would be even better. Of course, you got to take a course and make sure you know what you're doing.
And you're doing
Otherwise,
it legally.
yeah, that could end badly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not on public land. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
That's
it's
cool.
kind of, yeah, it's hard to do legally because there's some really like weird contradictory rules. Like
Mm.
where I live on Massachusetts, if you go on like the Mass State website and you go to like kind of the homeowner area of the website, it'll say like burning leaves is bad for the environment, blah blah blah. And then if you go on the prescribed fire through Mass Wildlife part of the website, it's like burning the woodlands is really important for maintaining critical wildlife habitat. And you're like, huh, so if I burn the leaves at my house, I'm killing everything. But if I burn the leaves with you on a prescribed burn, that's good. And I think it's
Yeah.
just, you know, fire used to be a really common tool. And then like that power, both like literally and figuratively, has kind of been consolidated. And you know, people are nervous about burning and about allowing people to burn. And I think there's good reason behind that, but it also makes it really hard to take care of your land that way, even if you do have the knowledge and the skills.
Right.
Yeah, totally. So, you were kind of talking about acorns as being staples in the past and into a lot of cultures today still. So, why do you think like we kind of people in the West here kind of default to the belief that these staples must come from annual grains grown in a field or from the supermarket and all that?
I think it's really complicated. I was tracing that back for a long time, trying to understand that relationship for the book. And I think part of it has to do with land access and the way that we have lost a lot of land access. You know, if you look back historically in my ancestry, the people, most of the people I come from are from either England or Germany or France. And especially in England, there was this really long tradition of woodlands being used in common. So, being carefully regulated, and people had different rights to different aspects of the woodlands. But even up until 1850s, 1860s in the US, anywhere that was quote unquote unimproved, even if it was private property, was considered fair game for hunting, gathering, grazing, often fishing. And after the close of the Civil War and the freeing of formerly enslaved people, those trespass laws started changing really fast. And so that's one thread where, all of us have lost a lot of access to woodlands. But there's also this other thread of like, the more I've learned about acorns, the more I've learned that people in different parts of the world have definitely used them as staple foods, but in different ways. In some
Hmm.
areas, you might like an acorn isn't just one thing, right? Like we talk about an acorn like, oh, your acorn is the same as my acorn, but that's not true at all. Like an acorn, now I have these acorn friends all over the world. And like my friend Ron Reed's acorn in California acts completely differently from my acorn on Cape Cod and differently from an acorn in Greece. And there's actually some sort of naturalized English oak stands in the area where I live. And I hadn't really experimented with them that much until recently. And I've been noticing as I work with them that the tannins are really hard to get out of them. And in
Mm.
England, there's this really long history of people using acorns as pig food and using them to fatten pigs and also feeding the branches to cattle. So, like, they were still this really important part of a food production system, but not necessarily, the most common direct table food. And I think that part of it also has to do with that of like, okay, when you get a dominant culture that's largely spreading the worldview of one place and one acorn, well, that person might not know what the acorn here is like, and that acorn might be really great for flour. So there's been kind of like a homogenization, I guess, if that's the right word, I think, at play also. And then add on to those two elements, the privatization of land and sort of the spreading of this one cultural story, then there's also the demonization of indigenous culture and indigenous food systems in North America and the erasure. And I think that all three of those layers have kind of worked together in the case of the acorn to make it a lot less common.
Yeah, totally. I think the food marketing too, it seems like the more I look into kind of traditional foodways and what people ate in the past, a lot of what we have today and our food beliefs today are so driven by this commodity culture and marketing, that has, I mean, it's just like with anything else. And there's at one point it was probably way too hard to go through and choose the right acorns, process them. You probably couldn't do it at scale like you could with some grains, and the industry just kind of then pushed that, and here we are. But yeah, it's interesting that we can
Yeah.
now rediscover it. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, oaks, I also forgot to mention, oaks do this cool thing called masting. So a lot of your listeners, people watching probably, they may know this if they're kind of in touch with oaks, but they don't produce the same amount of nuts every year. So, you're saying it's hard to fit them into a commodity model. And especially for oaks, that's true because they will produce a bumper crop of acorns one year, and then it might be a couple years of lower yields and then another huge crop. So it's not like something like a chestnut or a hazelnut where they produce a pretty consistent yield every year. And there's lots of different theories, ecological theories on why that's true. But from a food security standpoint, if you're gathering acorns, it doesn't really matter because the tannins are an amazing preservative and they'll last for decades. So, like, if the yield's a little inconsistent and you're feeding yourselves on a community level, well, that's fine. But if you're trying to make this commodity crop and you've got to have X amount every year and it's got to be exported and all this, then it starts to really break down when you try to fit it into that model.
Totally. Oh, on top of that, that just made me think, back then your staples were probably what you could easily access in your environment, but now with the exporting and travel and the way food can move even in a day, that probably that adds into it as well. And actually we had just a question from Gerald here. She asked that are acorns considered healthy for pig food versus grains, at least from our perspective, if we plan to eat them? I'm not 100% sure, but
I do know a little about, yeah, pigs who eat acorns are supposed to be actually super healthy and have a higher percentage of quote unquote good fats. I think it changes the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So, you might want to look up there's this ecosystem in Spain called the Dehesas, which is this oak dominated ecosystem with livestock mixed in. It's a really ancient form of agriculture. And often pigs there are grazed under the oak trees, and it's supposed to yield a superior hamon product. So,
man,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, even if they're not healthier per se, I'm sure they would taste really good. And it's just the idea of it sounds really good to me.
Some nutty pigs.
I mean, I used to hunt wild boar in Germany a lot, and I mean they love the acorns, so I'm sure it's in them, kind of instinctively.
Definitely. I have a friend who was paying people to collect acorns. At the end, he was trying to fatten up his pigs before slaughter here on Cape Cod, and he said it made an amazing meat. So I don't think he tested the health benefits, but it definitely tasted good.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I know that you introduced the idea that humans are like a keystone species. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So as I started learning more about the ancient relationships between humans in a variety of cultures and oak trees, and getting to know more about the fire element, I started realizing that as I was piecing these stories together, all these different cultures had stories about oaks as kind of like the tree of life, like this really important cultural tree, and also had stories about humans getting the gift of fire. And there was this cross-cultural narrative of humans kind of using fire on the land. And when I started looking at different ecosystems and some sort of like fire ecology histories, one fire historian was calling humans the fire animal and saying, like,
Mm.
basically, there's all these different kinds of keystone species. And I remembered some of them because I was a environmental studies major in college, and I was like, okay, right. You need the predators because they keep the prey populations in check. You need mutualists like bees because without them you don't get pollination and then you lose a bunch of food for the ecosystem. There's plants like oaks that keep the food web humming. That's kind of another category. But then there's this category called ecosystem engineers, and that's animals like beavers, right? So a beaver chomps down trees, creates these dams, creates wetlands, and really changes and designs and maintains this wetland ecosystem. The same is true of elephants in their own way through trampling and uprooting. And humans, historically, our biggest role on the land has been to manipulate ecosystems with fire. And so,
Mm.
as I started learning more about the relationship between humans and oaks and fire, I started to see that actually we have this really important role to play. I was reading all these papers about the oaks having trouble regenerating. I went down to Pennsylvania to this big state forest land, and I remember having this conversation with a forester whose job had basically two parts. And one part was to prevent forest fires, and the other part was to encourage oak regeneration. And those two jobs are completely at odds with
Yeah.
each other if you know anything about fire ecology. So I just sort of had this moment of like, wow, we've gone so deep in the fire suppression era that like we've kind of lost sight of our job ecologically. And, we have this narrative in Euro-American culture about pristine wilderness and like these spaces like the Cape Cod National Seashore around my house. If you go on the website, there's language about how it's wild and pristine and like this natural area, but actually the landscape that we see was traditionally tended with human fire. And so there's this kind of urge to like write this ancient practice out of the narrative. And I think a lot of that has to do with, indigenous history in the US in terms of colonial rule, trying to force that out of the story and people's awareness. But really a lot of these species, like, I'm kind of not sure I believe in the words natural and wild anymore in the way that they're commonly used, because they're often used to like put up this line between people and the living world. And
Mhm.
we're part of it. Like, we have a role to play. We're not doing the best job with that role in a lot of cases right now, but it's not as simple as, oh, it would be better off without us. We've all seen those post-apocalyptic movies where like, oh, yay, humans are gone and the earth is thriving. But
Some of those are
the
crazy.
reality, yeah, no, the reality, at least for like some of these really important keystone plants like oaks, is actually a lot more complex.
Mm.
That's cool. So on top of that, we actually like that kind of this goes with what you were just kind of talking about. Mike Mason, one of our listeners, he asks if you think that we should do more controlled burns in general.
Definitely. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that the amount of land that we're burning right now is very small compared with the amount of land that, in order to maintain ecosystems, we need to keep up with. Um, I I think I went on 5 or 6 burns this spring, and even with just a crew, like I don't know, there's usually like 20 people that go on these burns, and you can get a lot done in a day, but it's only like, 20 people doing these few areas all over the state. And even that is a lot of work. Like, it takes a lot of humans to put the fire on the land that the land needs in order to kind of stay healthy. And I think, we're seeing that in the West with these wildfires, but what we're not noticing as much because they're not as loud and obvious is changes in eastern forests with lack of fire. So, we're not
Mm.
seeing these catastrophic wildfires, but we are seeing big shifts in the forest composition. And a lot of foresters are kind of desperately planting to try to get oaks back on the landscape. Because what happens, if you're not burning, then succession keeps going, right? Succession is that process of going from like a bare field all the way to a closed canopy, shade dominant forest. And oaks don't thrive in that. So we're seeing these shifts, but they're not loud and flashy. So I think people aren't as aware of them.
Mm.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, Mike also made a comment that there's a lot more ticks, and I have heard people kind of saying that this could be due to less burns in general. Yeah, so
Yeah, I
insects are
don't know as
impacted too.
much. Yeah, I don't know as much about the ticks, but I know that like in traditional oak tending, at least in California, fire has been used not just to kind of control succession, but also to control insects, to control pathogens, to control even like the water cycle. So a lot of Kuruk elders had been saying for a long time, there's too many trees on the landscape, there's too many trees, because what happens when there's more trees is like all those trees need water, right? And then the landscape is becoming more dry. And then in addition to
Mm.
having more fuel, it's also a drier landscape. So then instead of having this kind of like steady state oak grassland where you're keeping it in the same stage of succession in this like intermediate stage, you get this ping ponging. So you're going from like an extremely dense, dry, flammable forest all the way back to like scorched earth and then starting over. And that's not really like it doesn't have to be that way. We can keep
Mhm.
things a little more calm and a little more well managed. There was that thing where I think it was Trump was talking about, we need to vacuum the forest or rake the forest or whatever it was. And I don't think raking or vacuuming is going to do the job, but we do need to maintain our forests, and we need people in order to do that. Like we need people who have that as their job. And so, yeah, I think we're in a moment where we're not, we're losing people from those jobs where we need to be adding people to them.
Mm.
It's kind of interesting. Growing up in Germany, there's no public land, so like when people buy land,
Mm.
they usually buy forest, and they're very proud of it because it's
Yeah.
such a limited resource. And over there, it's like a thing that you go and you clean your forest. Like
Mhm.
your
Yeah.
forest has to look perfect,
They
And
are
I
immaculate.
yeah, I always laugh at it, knowing what like how we do it here. But there is maybe a strategy to it, even if they don't know it themselves. So
Mhm.
it is
Yeah,
kind
and
of interesting to
maybe
hear
there's
that.
like an intermediate between the vacuumed forest and the completely unmanaged forest. Like maybe we don't have to go to either extreme, and we can lightly lightly tend the forest.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that. So in your new book, you explore a wide range of trees and mention a few. Everything with the oaks. I think you also kind of get into chestnuts, right? And
Yeah.
some other nut trees. So, which ones surprised you the most in terms of like food potential?
I think they were all surprising in different ways. Like one thing that surprised me about hazelnuts is the fact that there's like a whole coalition of growers in the Midwest in the US today who are really seriously considering and implementing hazelnuts as an alternative to soybeans.
Mm,
So soy, is used in a ton of processed food, and it has a bunch of environmental drawbacks. You're getting runoff, you're needing fertilizers, pesticides, all that.
Mm.
And really, it's losing carbon and organic material from the soil the way that it's done in sort of conventional industrial ag. And they're seeing that hazelnuts can actually be made into a lot of the same industrial foods. And, whether or not we want to do that is a whole other argument that we don't have to get into at this moment. But it's interesting to see the farm culture shifting and adapting to try to use this perennial crop where like you're storing carbon in the soil. It's a native crop, you're restoring some biodiversity, So that really surprised me. I wasn't expecting that when I first started getting to know these different growers and kind of learning more. Um, with chestnuts, I think the biggest surprise was just how many chestnuts people in Europe used to eat. I first started learning about chestnut culture when I visited a friend in Switzerland, and we were walking through this like Swiss landscape, and there were these empty kind of like huts, and I was like, what are those huts for? And she was like, oh, those are the stalls. In the fall, they fill them with chestnuts, and they start these fires on the bottom floor, and then the smoke cures the chestnuts. And
Oh.
yeah, it was really cool. And she introduced me to this local woman who was the head of the chestnut cultivators in that village. And I did a whole interview with her, and she had these amazing numbers from, going back 100 years, 200 years. And this is in this Alpine Valley, right? So, like, you're not growing grains in the Alps. That's not going to work. It's this really steep slope. And chestnuts were their staple food there and in a lot of other mountainous areas. And the average person was eating 330 pounds of chestnuts per year. So, to put that in perspective, we Americans today are eating, like, I think on average 150 pounds of grains per year, and we're eating a lot of grains. But that is just a stunning level of chestnut consumption. And there was like this whole pretty lengthy period in Europe where chestnuts were a huge, huge food.
Hmm.
So that was another big surprise. And with acorns,
You
I
just to
think,
interrupt you real quick. Do you know
yeah,
what species that was?
I think it's just European sweet chestnut. So
Okay.
Castanea sativa, I want to say.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've just it's an interest. The chestnuts are awesome. Like I wish we had more of them in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that here, because of the blight, the most promising species right now are hybrids and a lot of like Chinese chestnuts. But the European ones, they get really big and they're beautiful.
Hmm.
They're just a beautiful tree and a beautiful nut.
I don't know if I've ever seen a chestnut tree in person. I've never had a nut though,
Not in
for sure.
Montana, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the leaves are kind of like well, they're relatives of oaks. They're in the same
Mhm.
family. And the leaves kind of look like this like canoe shape, I guess you would
Mm.
say. Kind of like a
Yeah.
beach leaf, a beach tree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lindy, I think we saw one during our trip in May in Germany. I remember there was a night
Did
like
we?
this cool flowering plant, like had these awesome flowers. I'm pretty sure that was a chestnut and I pointed it out.
It's
But
totally
next
possible.
next
I
time
don't
we're in
remember.
Germany, I'll show you next time we're there. Because as a kid, that's like one thing I kind of did when I got into foraging with my mom was like go out and get chestnuts, but mostly for just decoration. We never ate the wild ones back then.
Mm.
But yeah, I'd love to grab some of those.
Well,
So
it's also confusing because there is the horse chestnut, just for
mm,
those listening. So if it's like all rounded, the nut, it's a horse chestnut, and if it has a little point, it's a true chestnut.
okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I'll have to do some more digging into that one. So I'm sure you're like met, with researchers, foragers, probably some indigenous kind of knowledge keepers during your time, and even farmers, during your time of researching and writing this book. So was there like one story or maybe a moment that really stuck with you, like emotionally?
I think that, my time when I was out on the Klamath with this medicine man and cultural biologist, Ron Reed, we had built up like years of talking on Zoom before we met in
Mm,
person. And uh, there's so much violence in the history between my people and his people. And it was really incredible. And I'm still so grateful to him for being willing to trust me and for taking the time to build that trust and to try to do some of this work together of sharing knowledge, like looking back at the history and figuring out ways to move forward, because I think that something that I think I knew but didn't like fully know is like, in order to heal this kind of broken relationship with the land that a lot of us have, I think we also have to deal with the cultural trauma that's gone with it. Um, it's not, it's not something that's happened overnight. Like, there's a reason that a lot of us don't know these foods are edible. There's a reason that a lot of us have lost touch with these foods, and it's part of a much bigger cultural story. And I think that spending time with Ron and getting to know him and building trust and going through that process together for me was just as important as learning how to process an acorn, the more like hands-on practical parts of it.
Mm.
That's awesome.
So, how do some of these trees and crops kind of compare to industrial foods, like as far as the nutrition, the calories, the land use potential?
Yeah, I did a lot of comparing in the book because I think I just kept being nervous. Like, I don't know, what if they really don't produce enough? Or what if they're not that good for you? Or what if this isn't a good idea? Um, but everything that I found kept reaffirming the importance of these nuts as a food source. I, um, looked at, if you look at the nutrition of nuts versus grains, um, they're honestly, in a lot of ways, pretty similar. What's happened with grains is like we refine them and take all the nutrition out of them. They're not inherently bad for us, they're good for you. But when you take them out, something I read said that the top source of calories for most Americans was refined grain desserts, which I found quite alarming and might
Interesting.
explain, yeah, explains a lot.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that I learned nutritionally was that so a lot of grains and nuts are really high in these B vitamins that are important for us. Um, and it turns out that our bodies actually need those B vitamins to process the carbohydrates. So that was one really
Mm.
cool thing that I started learning when I was looking at the nutrition. So if we keep nuts in their kind of, whole food form, which doesn't mean no processing, but does mean like using the whole thing and not trying to
Mhm.
refine it, um, they're kind of this complete package. They have some carbohydrates, some protein, some fat, very different ratios depending on the nut. We talk about nuts and nutrition as if it's this like simple thing, but a hazelnut is like mostly fat, a chestnut is mostly starch. They actually serve pretty different roles in terms of our metabolism and our bodies. And an acorn is kind of an interesting blend where, like, depending on the species, you might get more fat, less fat. One cool thing about acorns is you can make acorn oil out of some species, which I
Mm.
was totally surprised when I learned that. There's a really cool forager in Wisconsin, Sam Thayer, who has
Yep.
been making acorn oil. Yeah, he's amazing. And I bought some, and it's like this stunning sunset glow orange color, and just a super cool oil. So the nutrition kind of varies, depending on which species and which nut. But when we're using them in whole form, they all have a lot to offer nutritionally. And then from a yield standpoint, I think I'd always absorbed this story of like, oh, we all used to be hunter gatherers and then we became farmers because, as populations grew, there wasn't enough food. And that story turns out to be total crap. But it's not true. I mean, I could say so much more, but that's just not true at all.
Yep.
That story is like a very recent little tale that we made up in the early 1900s, basically as part of the scientific racism movement. So we're going to let go of that one. And if you start comparing yields of these monocultures to yields of polycultures and farms where, I went to a really cool farm in Iowa where they had this amazing polyculture of chestnuts and pawpaws and all these other species. And I was reminded that yield is a ratio. So when we say that these monocultures have super high yields, we're only talking about one part of the ratio. We're talking about what's coming out. We're not talking about what's going in. So when you
Mm.
count all of the land that's actually required to produce that yield, the yield is significantly lower than a polyculture. And if we are actually serious about feeding the world, which is always, the argument that gets thrown out against these wild foods, we do have to count all the land we're using. And when you do that, those monocultures cannot compete yield-wise at all.
When you say all the land, you mean also like the land the trucks travel on and everything, or?
Well, all the land, like, so say you're planting a monoculture of soy, and you're using a tractor with fuel, and you bought your seed from somewhere else, and you got your fertilizer from somewhere else. All these inputs required other land to produce that high yield.
Yeah.
And that's not true of these polyculture systems in most cases. So there's been some really interesting studies, and they found that when you count those, it's reversed. The monoculture yields significantly less than the polyculture. And when we're looking big picture, land is the limiting factor, and that is what we need to be counting in terms of yield.
Totally. Yeah, Mike just had a good comment. I thought he said, "I consider this too, and a good oak grove feeds wildlife fit for the table, squirrels to deer." Very true.
Yes,
awesome.
very true. And there was like this moment when the chestnut blight came through the US and North America as a whole. I think people then really felt that. So the blight showed up in the early 1900s, and within 4 decades rendered the American chestnut functionally extinct. And in addition to the chestnut itself being an important food, there was all this wildlife that was really important for people's tables, like Mike just mentioned. And those populations really dipped in a lot of places after the chestnut blight. So I think people in those communities, especially in Appalachian communities, it coincided with the Great Depression in a lot of places. And I went and interviewed a woman in one of those communities who ran one of the general stores. And she said, during that time, everyone was starving. And it wasn't because like they lost their stock portfolio. It was because of the chestnut blight and
Right.
just the lack of food for animals and people.
Yeah. Wow. And you mentioned you went to this polyculture farm. What was that called? I'd be interested to check that out. Do they have
That was
are they
called
online?
Red Fern. Yeah, Red Fern Farm in Wapello, Iowa.
Okay.
The coolest people. They're awesome. Tom Wall and Kathy Dice. They've got a bazillion species and experiments and like all kinds of fruits and nuts that I'd never heard of. And they've been at it for a while, since the 1990s. So a lot of their crops are getting really mature. They do like pick your own chestnuts, and they have a bunch of pawpaws, and they're Quakers and just really all around interesting people. I would highly recommend checking it out.
They'd be cool
Lindy,
neighbors.
yeah.
Very, yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Lindy, that might be a fun road trip one day. I
absolutely.
always love hearing how like those type of people make these things happen that, a lot of farmers would just like just not even consider, or just be like right out say it's not possible. But there's
Yeah.
people out there that show that there are cool things possible if you try and you experiment and try to kind of
Yeah.
rediscover these foodways,
Yeah, it's especially cool at their place because they're in the middle of corn and soy country. So it's like corn, 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 soy, soy, soy. And then you get there and it's like this amazing polyculture
Rebellion.
of these, yeah, like all these trees. And I think it's changing, like the perception of it. I think at first they said their neighbors were like, ah, and now people are coming and buying seedlings. Like they can't even keep up with their nursery because there's so many people interested. Because I think once you see something like that, people get it. They start to understand. And for that reason, I think, like you said, it's so amazing and important when people take the initiative to be like, I'm going to be the first one. I'm going to plant a living example of this thing that's kind of in my imagination right now. And it's for the rest of us to be able to go see it is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. So real quick, are there any cultural or culinary traditions that kind of stood out to you during your research? Maybe they're like, I'm thinking maybe like an indigenous one, or, more of a traditional one that people might not be in tune with anymore these days?
One thing that really stood out to me when I was researching acorns in particular was that Korean cuisine has a ton of traditional dishes made with acorn starch. And at
Mm.
first, I didn't even know, like, what is acorn starch? What are they talking about? But just like if anyone's ever made latkes, where you like grate the potato, put it in water, and the potato starch sinks down to the bottom. It's like this white, fine powder, just like cornstarch. So acorns have that in them too. And if you're processing your own, you'll start to notice that there's like this layer of starch on top of the ground acorns when you're soaking them in water. And Korean cuisine has made this into all these really cool foods. They make noodles out of acorn starch. They make this dish called dotori muk, which is basically like
Mm.
acorn jello slash tofu, but more jello-y. It's more
Mm.
like I used to go to my grandmother's nursing home and they would have like aspic, like the kind of weird jello, but it's made just using acorn starch, water, and salt. But then that on its own would be kind of like, do I want to eat this? But then they make this really fine julienne salad of like lettuce, peppers, scallions, ginger, carrots, and then this like ginger soy sesame dressing. And you put the whole thing together to make this dish called dotori muk. And I've tried it a few times now, and it was so good. And I had no idea that acorns made this starch that you could use in all these really creative ways.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
that is
think, I
super
mean,
cool.
there's other plants out there that you can do that with. So I'll have to explore that. I'll have to look up some recipes. That'd be a fun one to try out because we are planning on actually going to Wisconsin in September to the Wild Harvest Festival. Sam Thayer will be there too. He's one of the organizers of it, and hopefully we'll get to pick some acorns while we're there, like we did last year.
Nice.
Yeah, and then I
That's
just brought
awesome.
him in a suitcase, brought him to Montana. Um, I
TSA
don't
was
know.
like, "What is this guy doing?"
Yeah.
We did not quite sure. We get pulled
I love
aside a
that.
lot.
Yeah, I would imagine. I would imagine. That sounds
One thing
fun.
that I loved with your book is you talked a lot about how to eat the nuts. What was it like diving in to the kitchen side of this as kind of a beginner?
It was challenging, honestly, at first. I mean, acorns need processing, like we talked about before, and different species of acorns need different processing. So even when I would like find, I would talk to Ron Reed in California, and he's describing traditional Karuk processing, and that seems to be working. Nothing, my acorns are not responding to this method at all. There's still tannins in them. They're still bitter. Um, and so I ended up just having to try a lot of really different things with acorns. And where I live, there's acorns from both the red oak family and the white oak family. And even kind of between those two families, they seem to like different things. So that's been definitely a learning curve. And then just like it's been really fun collecting cookbooks. Like I found these like
Mm.
historic chestnut cookbooks. I've collected a couple acorn cookbooks and just experimenting and kind of like thinking outside the box. Like, okay, if I want these nuts as like a really important part of my diet, then I want to try a lot of different things, right? So like experimenting with anything from like a crepe to a nut seed cracker. I met a woman in Maine who was making acorn sourdough, which I was like, what? How do you do that?
Yum.
That was really cool. She had like gotten it up to the percentage where she could use like 70% acorn flour,
Whoa.
30% wheat flour. Um, I ended up experimenting a little with different like grinds because with a lot of these nuts, just like with grains, like especially with chestnuts and acorns, you can do like a fine grind to have like a flour, but you can also do a more coarse grind to have almost like that stone ground cornmeal type texture. or you can
Mm.
even go coarser. Like Sam Thayer had a recipe for an acorn chili where the acorns are functioning almost like beans. Um,
Mm.
so it's been fun playing not just with like flavor, but also texture and processing techniques. And then in the case of chestnuts, it's been fun trying chestnuts from different farms. There's a co-op in Ohio that sells chestnut flour, Midwest grown chestnut flour online, and they have different flavors. And then, I've found that nuts from different farms act differently and are good for different things. So there's a lot of nuance for sure. And like, it's kind of like imagine if we lost everything we knew about cooking with wheat and you're trying to like make a croissant, right? Like
Oh
Yeah.
it's
man.
gonna take a minute to figure that out. Like,
Yeah.
and you're
People
gonna
are
need a
still
lot of
figuring it out.
people. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you're gonna need a lot of people and a lot of opinions. And like the more people we get into these foods, I think the more elevated the cuisine becomes because you just have more brains on the question. And I think
Hmm.
that's part of what's exciting in terms of like networking and talking to other people, playing with them.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people get kind of stuck in like peanut butter and almond
Yeah.
butter. Hazelnuts must be hazelnut butter. Whatever.
Nutella.
Yeah.
Nutella. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. People get very one track mind about it. So it does take a lot of brains in the kitchen to bring out some cool discoveries for sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm so pumped though that you are like out there. You spent what 5, 6 years of your life trying to rediscover this. How to do all some of this, and it's just super special in that way.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a lot of fun, and it's cool to like there's this group called the American Hazelnut Company, which is kind of part of that network of growers I was talking about, experimenting with what can you do with hazelnuts that you can also do with soy. And
Hmm.
they're like making these little snack mixes called Midwest Munch, like kind
That's
of
cute.
combining. It's really good too. My kids are kind of like my guinea pigs because they can be very picky and annoying. So I'm like, okay, if it passes through them, like I think the mainstream American consumer can handle it. And they have strongly approved the Midwest Munch. They're like all about this little hazelnut snack.
Kid approved. That's
Yeah, they need
awesome.
like a little stamp. Um, so yeah, it's cool to see different things that people are doing.
So, for anyone listening that kind of wants to start engaging with nut trees, either planting or foraging, where do you recommend they should begin?
I think that the place to begin is like in your place where you live, figure out what the keystone species are, and then start learning about the history of human relationship with them. We might not all live in a landscape where oak is a keystone species or is even on the landscape at all. Like I've talked recently with some people in Australia, and at first I was like, what am I going to talk to them about? Like, I don't know what the important plants are there. Um, but from that, everything expands. Like if you can figure out what the keystone species are where you live in terms of plants and get to know them, get to know how people use them traditionally, because I guarantee you, if they are a keystone species, humans have some relationship with them.
Mm.
And they're part of that food web, if not like the foundation of the food web. And so if you start with that, and start there, it gets you into a different kind of relationship with your ecosystem. Because if we're doing our job right as humans, in order to be a keystone species in a positive capacity, we need to know what the other players are and the other keystone species are and make sure that we're also promoting their habitat. So we're creating abundance at like the ecosystem level, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah,
Definitely.
totally. That's awesome. So this might be a kind of a tough question, but I'm sure you've kind of thought about it. I mean, it's part of your, I think, kind of the ethos of your book too. And like, what does a resilient nut-centered or tree-centered food future look like to you? You know?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of questions that come up for me when I start thinking about that, about settlement patterns. we're organized into this, kind of urban, suburban, often really separated from rural places system right now. And it's, I'm sure there's ways of making that work. And I also think that it's worth thinking a lot about how we're organizing our communities as we continue moving forward. And as we think about how does our food system, we have so many different kind of systemic crises right now in terms of like, you know, food nutrition, food access, affordable housing. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the way that we're organizing. And so as we think about our relationship with these plants and these foods, I think we need to do it at the systemic level, and really think about our communities in a holistic way and how to make the full system work, not just like one aspect of the system, because we keep doing that and that doesn't seem to be going great. So as
Yeah.
we kind of move into a future with these plants, I think it would be awesome if the plant people could be kind of leaders of, okay, like we want to incorporate these plants into our communities. How do we do that in ways that really work at the community level?
Hmm.
Yeah. And then more polycultures on farms and stuff like that.
Yeah, for
Showing
sure.
like maybe like education programs showing farmers the value of it and things like that.
And
That
showing
should
the
clean
Yeah,
our food bill.
the transition, I think a lot of farmers
yeah.
go, well, that's a lot of stuff to try to implement. And if you give them one step per year that they do, and in 10 years, they've got this totally new agricultural system,
Yeah,
that
I
would make
think that
sense.
one place that's doing a really good job of that is the Savannah Institute in the
Mm.
Midwest. Their whole model is based on this traditional indigenous food system in the Midwest based on an oak savanna. So, oak savannas
Mm.
are this really productive ecosystem tended with fire traditionally. And the Savannah Institute is really working with farmers on the system level, making them aware of the species in the oak savanna, growing a lot of these species in a nursery that they run, and communicating with farmers who are in the more traditional row crop model about how to transition and how to kind of slowly create systemic change on their land and on their farms. So that's definitely a resource for people out there who are interested in learning more. And they're part of a network of growers, kind of all working toward that goal. So there's tons of folks to learn from in that network.
Mm.
Is there like a nut tree that grows in the US natively that like you know that people might not know about? Like people have heard about acorns, chestnuts. They might not know they were edible. But like in general, is there a tree that like you learned about where you're like, wait, this is a thing? Like
I think I had no idea. I think people have heard of hickories, but I had no idea how important hickories were as a food source throughout a lot of Eastern North America. I'm not as sure about the role of hickories in the West, but a lot of woodlands out here used to be oak hickory woodlands. And through clear cutting and sort of regrowth, we've lost a lot of that diversity. But at one of the places I visited, this place in Asheville, North Carolina called the Nuttery, they were making this hickory milk, and you can make hickory oil. And I was just totally unaware of how versatile and delicious hickories are. So that's one tree that I was kind of pleasantly surprised by as I was learning more.
yeah, I have yet. I don't think I ever tasted actually hickory nut. Do you know if there's like special processing that needs to happen, like with the acorns?
No, it's not like that. It's more like a pecan. It's like in that family. And it has kind of like this round shell with four parts that drops off, and then I don't know, it almost looks like a walnut or a pecan. So it does have a hard shell, but then once you get in there, the nut is just good to eat. And very
Cool.
oily. So like super high in fat, kind of an amazing like winter calorie resource.
Mm.
Mm. I'll have to start
Yeah.
looking for those in Wisconsin too. when I'm back. So I'd love
Excellent.
to, people in chat right now, if you have any more questions for Elspeth, now's the time to put them into chat. We'll try to touch on them quickly. Mike did say that he suspects that pin oaks would make a good oil. Do you know what oak
Yeah, we have
species
pin
is
oaks.
used?
So Sam Thayer was going more to like the southeast of the US, and I think he was using, I might get this wrong off the top of my head, but I want to say water oak and maybe laurel oak, if that's a species. I know water oak was one of them. And I'm pretty sure he has somewhere on his website, he has it written or in one of his field guides. I can double check on that. But I think pin oak would probably be really good too. I've opened them, and if you open an acorn, one way to kind of tell if it's good for oil or not is the more orangey it is, the more oil it has. So if it's like super pale and white, it's not going to be that good for oil. And in general, oaks in the red oak family, which includes a lot of different species, including pin oak, tend to be oilier than white oaks. So that's kind of a rule of thumb in terms of attempting to play around with the oil.
Did you use it for cooking? Like, did you test it at high heats and low heat kind of to see how it, did it burn quickly or?
It's basically chemically almost identical to olive oil in terms of the way that it cooks. So it has a little bit of a different flavor. This one person I saw write about it as like a switch hitting oil. So like you could go savory, you could go sweet. It's a little more neutral in terms of savory versus sweet than olive oil is. Like I think of olive oil as pretty firmly savory.
Yeah.
But it's good. It's almost like a little fruity. I was putting it on popcorn with nutritional yeast for a while, mostly because it was just so beautiful. But I also canned bluefish tuna using, like normally I would have used a tablespoon of olive oil, and I used the acorn oil, and it worked really well for a pretty large variety of things. I wouldn't, try to get it to a super high heat similar to olive oil. Like that's not the best application of it. But if you're using kind of low heat, just sauteing, be fine.
And do you know, is that something people could do at home pretty easily? Make their own oil?
So it would depend on having access to those species. And Sam did describe to me his process in detail, but I did not have any of the equipment that he was mentioning. I think that if you are set up to make oil in general, like seed oil, it's not that different. I am personally not yet set up to do that, so it was a little over my head in terms of exactly what machinery was going to be involved. But I don't think it's, he was producing it and selling it for a while, and I think that, obviously if you can do it at scale, it's going to be less expensive. But if you're just doing it for home use, the answer is that I haven't tried it yet, but it seems doable.
Yeah. I'll have to look into that more. That'd be pretty cool to do. We have we've only done like, lard and tallow from the animals we hunt and things like that, but never from a plant. Might be kind of interesting to get into, explore.
Yeah, I think I know too, like hickories, those super oily nuts, like hickories, walnuts, hazelnuts, those I think are even easier to make oil from what I've heard from others.
Okay. So actually going along with that, Mike had a question he asked. So real question, do you separate out the tannic acids before oil harvest?
No, so that's one really cool thing about tannins is that they're water soluble. So just like with olive oil, to make table olives, because olives are also very high in tannins, to make table olives, like for us to eat, you have to put them in brine and leach out those tannins using water. But for olive oil, you just press the olives and the tannins are not in the fat. So same thing with acorn oil, the tannins are not in the fat. The oil doesn't require processing to get rid of the tannins.
That's good to know. And then do you know, is it like a heat press or like a cold press? Do you know how they
Cold
do it?
press. Yeah.
Cold press. Yeah, that's higher quality oil anyway. that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the reason is to maintain quality for that.
Yeah, totally. Sweet. Well, Elspeth, is there anything else that we didn't touch on today that you really wanted to get out there? We tried to touch on a lot of points in your book, and well, of course, we'll have you share where people can find it, what it's called, and follow you and all that. But I'm just curious, is there anything else that you wanted to get out?
I think the one thing that I would say is that learning more about these nuts actually also introduced me to a lot of other wild foods and species, just because as this like keystone plant, they're in relationship with so many other plants, fungi, animals, even fish in some ecosystems. And it's been really cool entering the ecosystems through that lens of oaks and chestnuts and hickories and these other keystone nuts, and then kind of learning to get to know who else is around them. Like I had never used reishi before, but reishi grows a lot out of oak stumps where I am. So that was like this other fungi that I met just through getting to know them. And the same is true for different wildlife species and other plant species. So, just in terms of the relationships, I think that's been a really fun layer. And then adding that into cooking, like I've noticed that a lot of nut dishes go really well with mushrooms, and often it's like the
Mm.
same mushrooms that you're finding growing in relationship with these hardwood
Ooh,
trees. So,
that might
yeah,
be the
that's
code.
been cool.
That might be the secret. Try to match your terroir like that. I like that. That's awesome.
That's been really fun.
Lindy, did you have any more questions?
No, we answered pretty much everything I had.
Cool.
Yeah.
There's one more I want to address. One more comment, quick. It asks, Poldy, have you harvested cattail greens? Will you try harvesting cattail pollen for flour? And we wanted to this year, but it just ran away from us. And we just checked, and they're like already pollened out. Basically, I'm gonna this weekend drive around and kind of see if I can find some more somewhere. But the spots that we had picked out were just a little too late in that. Have you done
Yeah.
any cattail foraging, Elspeth?
Um, yeah, I've actually recently started foraging some cattails to weave with. I got
Mm.
super into weaving through the process of researching this book because a lot of these nut species actually have been used in basketry.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
and those led me to cattails because people were making little handles and ropes out of cattails. And I've been eyeing this video of a cattail sun hat that I'm just desperate to make. So I went out with a friend the other day in a canoe and we found a really good spot and picked a bunch. But I haven't eaten them yet. And that's something that I've been really wanting to experiment with. And actually, getting ready for this conversation, I saw that you had a ton of content on there. So I got excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an
And
edible.
there's a
Yeah.
lot, they're abundant here. So it's
Tons.
exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, they're definitely have become quickly one of our favorite plants to forage for. And I'm always looking for plants that bring a lot of caloric value and also just like abundance. I wouldn't say cattails have a ton of calories, but the nuts do. So
Mhm.
we're hoping to explore those a lot more. As far, out here we have pine nuts. We don't have pinyon, but we have like lodgepole pine. And I've been doing some research, but it seems like the seeds are very small, so it's going to be a lot of processing. But I'm
Yes.
I'm up for it. I want to definitely try that out to see if we can get some lodgepole pine nuts and ponderosa pine and stuff like that.
Cool.
It'd be
That
fun.
sounds like fun. Well, we'll have
Yeah,
to trade nut and cattail knowledge because I've definitely
totally.
gotten really excited about cattails recently.
Yeah, no, definitely ask away. And we have one podcast episode with Clay Bowers, who I don't know if you came across him in your research, but he's one of our good friends, and he's been foraging for like 20 years. And in that podcast we go deep into the cattails, real deep.
Mhm.
Okay,
So
good to
that's
know.
a great one if you want to nerd out, and
Yep.
really learn about it. And then
Cool.
So where can people buy your book? Do you have a copy? We just had the digital version sent to us. So I was going to hold it up, but I don't
I
have one.
just had a copy, but my husband
Here,
stole it. He's
let me
been
let me let me pull up. Let
It's
me see.
right
Is it on your
here.
Instagram?
It's on my Instagram. It's on my website, which is elspethhay.com, and it's also available on all major booksellers online. So, and also go ask your local bookshop because I would so much rather it's available there than through the, major retail giants.
Yeah,
So,
no, I like that a lot. I'm just gonna share my screen quick so we can show people what it looks like. The cover, awesome
sweet.
cover here. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Be coming through.
Yep.
Yeah, awesome cover.
Nice.
Feed us with trees. Highly, highly recommend. Like I said at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, I didn't finish it yet, but so far I'm loving it, and you did a great job with this. So it's
Thank you so
just a great
much.
addition to my foraging shelf because I don't have much about trees yet, so foraging trees. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's always
And
exciting to add a new book to your foraging shelf, in my opinion.
Yeah.
oh
Like,
yeah,
We
woohoo!
we've got a lot of books.
I just had an order come in with like 3 new ones. So yeah,
My
and I'm
family's always
sure.
like, another one.
Yeah.
Well, what are like your future plans? Are you like planning on doing more on social media, or you know more how to maybe and stuff like that, or do you have anything
Yeah,
planned in
I
that
think
regard?
I've been so focused on kind of like the narrative book and now getting that out into the world. But now that that's out there and I'm talking with people about it, I've really been playing a lot more with different recipes. And so I'm hoping that, down the line, a cookbook might be in the works
Mm,
because we have so much to learn. And I'd love to network with different people, kind of, go through the same process I went through with a lot of the growers, and talk more about the cooking, and get some hands-on techniques to folks because that is such a big question. And there's a lot of knowledge out there, but it's not all like in the same spot. So
mm.
playing
Love
with
it.
that. Yeah.
That's awesome. That'll be exciting. And then before we end, I just want to say that Lindy and I are going to be in a podcast next week on the Urban Ag Podcast on YouTube. So for the people watching right now, should come check that one out. And maybe that would be a good one for you to get on too. I'll definitely give him your tell him about you and your book and stuff like that. So he just
Cool.
started his podcast, but he's been making YouTube videos for a long time and has some really good content. And I think
Mhm.
he's looking for more people. I think you'd be a great guest for his too.
Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Anything else you can get out there in terms of like where people can find you? Instagram, right? We said.
Yeah, my Instagram's at Elspeth Hay. My website's elspethhay.com. And those two places are where I post most of my content. You can also find a link there to the local food report, which is the weekly radio show I produce for my local public radio station. And that's a lot of fun. Even if you're not on Cape Cod, often a lot of it applies to other areas as well. So that's a super fun way to connect too.
Awesome.
Awesome.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. For those who were here live, and yeah, hopefully we can do another podcast with you sometime and dive deeper maybe into one species or a few. So that'd be cool.
Sweet. Thank you
Awesome.
so much for
All right.
having me.
Bye bye, guys. Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Let me just end the stream quick.